Welcome. Today we're going to be creating this. Alright, so now we're back here in After Effects. So let's start by making the text. So let's click on the text tool here. Let's just write awesome. Oh yeah. Let's just align this text to the middle of the screen by going up into a line so it's nice and centered. And now we can right click on the text and click Layer Styles. Go down here and choose Bevel and Emboss. So let's go down here to the actual effect. Let's start by making the technique chiseled hard. So if we actually zoom in, you can see it has this nice hard edge. We can even increase the multiply effects and maybe increase the size a smidge. We can play around with this later on. We can even choose a little bit of a bolder font. There we go, something robust such as this. If that doesn't look like a glass font, I don't know what does. So let's go down here into Animate in the text layer and let's choose Tracking. That way we can actually offset the space between the letters, which is just plain cool. Something along these lines. So now we have this text, so let's start by pre-composing it. So layer, then pre-compose, because we want this to be able to be in its own layer so we can reuse it several times. I'm just going to call it text. There we go. So let's go back up into our main comp. Now we can make the noise. So let's create a layer and solid. Let's call this texture because we like that texture. We're just going to straight up pre-compose this immediately. We're going to call this texture, obviously, because why would we call it anything else ever at any point in time? And now let's go over into effects. Let's apply a fractal noise, because that is one of the sexiest effects that exist on the face of this earth. So now we have a good old-fashioned boring noise. So let's start by changing it a bit. Let's say dynamic. Let's invert it. Let's stretch it out a bit here. Let's just really expand this, something like this. Maybe make it thinner. Something along these lines. Something quite stretchy. So let's make a new adjustment layer. Where are you? There. Because we want to remap the black and white to new colors. So I'm going to call this CC for color correction. And I go over here and I'm going to choose CC Toner. CC stands for Sidecore. It's just a certain brand of plugins. So you just double click on CC Toner. Right now it's choosing 3 colors, but we want 5 because we're quite frankly greedy. So we can just start by playing with these colors. Maybe make it a little bit of a cyan, and I'm just going to color pick all these colors because it's all going to be variations of this color. So the lowest one, we're going to make it a little bit more blue, quite dark blue actually, something along these lines. The next to highest up, we're going to do something more like this, a little bit more, play around with the hue. You know, you can just faddle until you're quite satisfied. You can find the right hue of blue that rhymes. And we can take it even darker, something along these hairlines, something like this. The cool thing is this is going to react to the contrast of the image. So if we play around with the contrast, it's going to adapt on the fly. And isn't that just plain awesome sauce? So we can just decrease the brightness a smidge, something along these lines. And we want to be able to animate this later on. So this offset turbulence, we're going to link this with a slider. So I'm going to go over into my original composition here. So I'm going to go up here into layer and create a new null object, and I'm going to call this control. And then I'm going to add an effect to it called a slider controller. Now these don't do anything unless you actually attach them to something else. So it's basically just a slider. I'm going to call this time anim, as in time animation. And go back into the texture, and I'm going to out-click on offset turbulence. I'm going to write big A, capital A. And I'm going to link to that effect we just made. So comp, choose the autofill and then the quotation marks. I'm going to choose logo anim glass clean. Dot layer. It's going to autofill again, quotation marks, and we want it to look at control layer, as you can see here. And the next one, we want it to look at an effect, again, quotation marks. And we're going to call this, we're going to want it to look at time anim. And we need one last little parenthesis and write 1. For some weird reason, we need that, otherwise it's going to complain. So now we can start square brackets because this property has two coordinates, x and y, which means it's an array. It is an array of values. So we're going to start by saying a, comma, 0. So x is going to be the a that we created, and y is going to do absolutely nothing. It's just going to be a sloth. So I forgot to add the text in our texture pre-comp here. So if you just add it down there and put it in overlay blend mode, there you go. So now it's overlaying and blending with the noise, and isn't that just dandy? So now we can animate the noise later on. So let's go back into our main composition here and take the texture down. We're gonna first of all apply a cool effect called CC Glass. Oh yes, double click on that bad boy. So see, now it's actually creating a bump map based on the luminance values of the text. And isn't that just cool? We're going to also change this light setup to use After Effects lights instead of built-in lights, because that way we can go up to Layer, New, Lights. We're going to make a parallel light, which is mimicking sunlight. It is one infinite light coming from one specific angle. We can even make it, you know what, let's make it a little bit cool, something like this. And bam, you can see a difference. So let's start by expanding this a smidge and moving the position so we can get these nice highlights from the side. Right now it's just dark and dank. So on this texture effect, we're going to apply an effect called Set Mate. And there we go, double click. Set Mate is awesome because you can make it look at another layer like the text layer and say, hey, mask yourself out based on the alpha of that layer. So let's play around with it. Let's decrease the softness quite a smidge. Something like this, maybe increase the height. We can even play around with the lights because right now it's too far back. We can take it forward a smidge. So something like this. We can even duplicate this light, Control D. Now we just move the position over here, maybe down a smidge, you know, make it a little bit dramatic. We can play around with this to our heart's content. So right now it still looks kind of weird, right? It's almost like it's very edgy and sharp and weird. So if we go over to texture and let's just decrease the softness quite a bit until, wait a minute, look at this, we're starting to get some edges. So let's look at this here. Let's also look at the height. Let's just try to find the optimal height for it to look around these here parts. We want quite a lot of displacement, we want a little bit of softness, something along these lines. So let's start looking at the texture, at the text dissolve. So let's add an image wipe to this layer here. Double click. And with an image wipe, you can see it's just taking the contrast of that noise to essentially just remove the image. So let's put it below the CC Glass, something along these hairlines. And let's call it Logo Dissolve. So we want the Logo Dissolve to affect every single layer we create here. So I'm just going to copy this. So I'm going to paste it on Control, select it, go up into Edit, and select Copy with Property Links. I'm going to go down into the texture layer, delete the original one, and paste the new one. Just put it above the CC Glass. So it's giving me an error for some weird reason. If I double press E, you can see it's the effect opacity that's giving me an error. I'm just going to disable that because I'm not going to use it anyway. And there you go. And I'm also going to paste this on the text. See, again, same error. Double press E, disable that expression. So I'm just going to animate this real quick. I'm going to set completion at 3 seconds. I'm going to go to 0 and I'm going to just set it completely to dark. There we go. So we just have it map on like this, nice and slow. All right. So we can go within text and we can animate the tracking of the text by going into Animate and Tracking. Let's say at 4 seconds or something, we can click on the tracking amount, keyframe it, then go to the beginning and let's say squish it together, quite a smidge. We can even go to the last keyframe, select it, right click, keyframe assistant, easy ease, so we get this nice little smooth. We can even go into the graph and extend the influence quite a smidge. I like it to ease out. So it's going to go really fast in the beginning, and it's going to ease into the last keyframe. So you can see just wing, something like this. Nice and smooth. So now we're going to animate the texture. So go to your control layer and let's click on the time anim. I'm going to press U to bring up the keyframes, and we're going to have it animate over time. So I'm just going to offset this to the right and do the exact same thing as before. Right click, keyframe assistant, easy ease, and let's make this nice and smooth in the graph editor. Something like this. Bam-a-lama ding dong. Now we have this. Let's start to look at the glints that we had before, those nice crisscross glints. So let's duplicate this texture layer and let's add an image wipe. Image wipe. Let's just isolate this for a second. I'm going to call this glint left. And now if we increase the dissolve, just like before, now we can actually dissolve part of the image. So something like this, and have it quite drastic, very little softness, something like this here. And now we're going to apply a directional blur, double click, and this only blurs in, you guessed it, one direction. So if we say 45, not like the band, but you know. So now we just increase the blur, and you see it actually creates this directional line. And we can also add a curves adjustment. Double click. And let's say alpha. Let's boost this. So now it's starting to appear better. Now we can unisolate this. Maybe set it to screen. See, now we're talking. We can even add a tint right after, or maybe even before the image wipe, so it's more a white glint than a color glint, but you can play with that. Now you can duplicate this glint, call it maybe right glint, and just add plus 90. Oops, 45 plus 90. See, now we already have that crisscross effect. See, it's only gonna glint on those highlights, and isn't that just plain dandy? Alright, and the cool thing is that this is procedural, so you can always go into text and say, you know what, I'm sick and tired of this font, so I'm just going to choose a new font, a better font, a more awesome font. So I'm going to choose this Boris thing and maybe even scale it down a smidge, something like this. Go back, bam, it is updated. Now we can maybe add some niceness by going to layer, adjustment layer, and I'm going to call this lens. As in a lens blur. I'm going to apply this across everything. I'm going to go over to effects and presets and choose a lens and camera lens blur. Now this is an awesome effect. It emulates depth of field, as you would see in a camera. So maybe, let's say 3 seconds, we can set it at 0, keyframe it at 0. And at the beginning we can maybe have like 30 or something extravagant. And maybe we can say diffraction, fringe, all the way up to 500 to really emphasize the highlights and the hexagons that appear around the highlights. We can even actually change the aspect ratio so it becomes more like a anamorphic lens, you know, I make it like really, really tall. We can even make the text scale towards the camera. So if we go, let's press U, so we only can see the keyframes that we already have. We can click on awesome. And we can maybe just scale it. Shift S for scale. Go to the first keyframe, scale it down a bit, something like this. Now we can maybe apply some very soft highlights to the entire thing. So maybe we can just take the text, duplicate it. Let's view this and isolate it. Let's not set it to overlay, let's set it to screen. And let's go over here into the effects and let's give it a fill, because we want it to have one solid color. And it seems to have very low opacity. So if we increase the opacity, maybe make it a nice bright cyan, something like this. We can have a nice mask across the entire thing by going up to mask and drawing a big square across it, you know, to a big square. And we're gonna feather this out. We're gonna expand this a smidge, something like this. Now deactivate it. See, now we have this nice little wrapping highlights around the text. We can even decrease the opacity. It might be a little bit too much. Maybe down to 50, so it's something subtle. Now let's start looking at those initial glints that you could see in the original one. And that is also quite easy. We go up to Layer, Solid. Let's say Glints. No, let's call it Sparkles. Everyone loves sparkles. And then we could go over here into the effects and call another fractal noise. As you know, I love fractal noise. And then we can choose small bumps. Let's increase the contrast quite a bit, something like this. Maybe even increase the brightness a bit just to get some more of them. And go down into transform here and just scale this bad boy down, something like this. Let's go over into mask, choose ellipse tool, double click, and now we'll automatically create a mask on the entire layer. We go down here and decrease mask expansion and feather it out a little bit, something like thus. Now we can set it to screen, so bam. And now we want this, of course, to have the same effect as before, the camera lens blur, because we want these to constantly sparkle. So we can also set this to 500, the diffraction fringe, and 0.2 in the aspect ratio. Right now there's a lot of them, so we can just increase the scale maybe to 40, something like this. Maybe decrease the brightness, there's quite a lot of them. If you want, you can even tint it, so you can get some more color in it, something like this. A little bit of cyan. Come on, everybody loves cyan. And we can even animate this just like before. So we can just Alt-click, hold Alt button down and click on evolution. And let's write time times, let's say, 20. Now it's just going to have these nice animated glints. And isn't that just plain sexy? So final part of the process, let's create the background. So let's go up here, Layer, New, Solid. Let's make it a nice dark blue. You know, some really nice dark blue. And I'm going to take it all the way down and call it BG, because it's a background. Actually, it's still a little bit too bright for my taste. I'm actually going to go up into Layer, Solid Settings, and darken it a little bit more. Make it a little bit less of that blue. There we go. Now I'm going to duplicate this. And I'll go up into Layer, Solid Settings, make it quite bright and quite cyan, something like this, something really nice and blue cyan thingamabob. And we're going to take this ellipse tool, and we're going to make it nice, and this nice wide thing, you know, highlight, go down into the mask. I'm going to feather this, and I want it to feather to the sides more than up and down, so I'm going to unlink, and I'm going to feather more to the sides, something like this. Then I'm going to duplicate this, and in the bottom one, I'm once again going to go Layer, Solid Settings, change the color to a little bit more bluish, something like this, and double click M to bring up all the mask settings, and I'm going to expand this a bit. You know, I want a little bit more color, something like this. Might be a little bit too much. We might actually, if you double click on M on the first layer, whoops, there you go. You can actually just decrease the size a bit, maybe decrease the feather a bit. Now we want the background layer to blink a little bit, so I'm just going to alt-click on opacity and write wiggle, which is basically going to make it flicker a bit. And I'm going to write 7 and 10. So the first value is how many times it does per second. Second value is how much it does it every single time it does it. So now it's going to blink just a little bit, and we're going to animate this so that around here it is full opacity, and at the beginning it is 0 opacity. And we want these two layers to follow along. So I'm going to select them, press T for opacity, Alt-click on one of them, and pick whip up to it. I'm just going to take this, copy, and paste on the bottom layer. So now it's just going to blink on. There you go. There we go. So you can play around with this to your heart's content. You can see even the glints are quite powerful, so you can always just decrease the alpha boost, something like this. And there you have it, a glass-looking logo-ish thingamabob. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys can create with this. And of course, I hope you have a wonderful day with some cheese.